Thank you, Jess. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Douglas Lilburn was rescued from mustering sheep on his sister's farm by an appointment as conductor of the NBS String Orchestra in Christchurch. His income there was supplemented by writing criticism for the Christchurch press, winning, he said, more enemies than friends. So, given Elizabeth Kerr's much longer involvement in music criticism, it's reassuring to see how many friends are here tonight. Elizabeth and I were music students together at Victoria University. We're about the same age, but Elizabeth, precocious as always, was a couple of years ahead of me. Our student years coincided with Douglas's establishment of the electroacoustic studio, with David Farquhar at the peak of his considerable ability, with the arrival of Ross Harris as a master student and then a junior lecturer. Elizabeth was one of an illustrious BMUS honours class that included Dennis Smalley and Lyle Cresswell, and they all achieved first-class honours. I remember the palpable excitement as they emerged from Jenny McLeod's analysis classes. What a stimulating environment, not least because the professor was the incorrigibly mischievous Frederick Page. Elizabeth headed off to Canada, I to the UK. We reconnected in the late 70s as colleagues at the Victoria University School of Music, where she taught analysis and music education and conducted the university choir. She sang in our 1988 production of Suor Angelica, as the Mother Superior, of course. Not long after, Elizabeth left to become manager of music programs for Creative New Zealand and then manager of RNZ Concert, who continue to make such a vital contribution to music in Aotearoa and who are recording tonight's lecture. Elizabeth was chief executive of Creative New Zealand for 6 years, from 2000, and I must say that when I went to the NZSO, it was great to have an old friend sitting at the table at our monthly meetings of creative sector Crown entities. Then followed a 6-year stint as the manager of the New Zealand String Quartet Trust. Elizabeth has served on numerous boards, including that of the Auckland Philharmonia. She chaired SOUNZ and Tawhiri Limited, the organisation responsible for the New Zealand Festival, the Wellington Jazz Festival and the Lexus Songquest. In other words, Elizabeth has been embedded in our musical culture for her entire adult life and understands it from multiple perspectives. Through all of this, she's been writing music criticism. In 1983, she followed Fred Page as a regular columnist for the New Zealand Listener. In 2019, Elizabeth established her own web-based critical journal, 5 Lines. Her articles are always pertinent, beautifully written, and many have been timely interventions. I'm thinking, for example, of her recent feature, We Need to Talk About Chamber Music. 5 Lines is an important presence on our musical scene, increasingly so as the mainstream dailies show more interest in promoting the real estate and travel industries than in covering what goes on in our concert halls. Elizabeth was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2013, and in 2021, she was awarded a Lilburn Trust citation for her outstanding services to New Zealand music. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture, as I'm sure you are. Please welcome Elizabeth to give the 2024 Lilburn Lecture.
Ena reo, ena mana, ena rao rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, Peter. It was nice and reassuring to know that I would be introduced by such an old friend. So I'll start tonight reading from a letter to the editor of the Evening Post from the 1970s, complaining about an excoriating review of the opening night of a production of Britain's community opera, Neues Flood, by a cast of children, with some professional musicians. Sir, an outraged Wellingtonian wrote, once again, your music critic has unleashed an acid flood of comment with barely an olive leaf of commendation, let alone a branch. Certainly the sound system did mar the performance of Neues Flood, but this can be adjusted, and the acoustics did not drown the timpani, and the children were not undisciplined in demeanour. A few more feathers would improve the dove's attire, but her dance was certainly not vulgar. and the Critic overlooked entirely the very delightful dance of the raven, enjoyable playing by the orchestra. Just what is meant by a fifth column of recalcitrance was enhanced by some of the finest bugle playing heard in this city for a long time. Again, this was ignored by your Critic. The Critic was Owen Jensen, and he replied, doubling down, "If asking for the best is being acidulous, then pass me the acid drops." This noise flood was no occasion for olive branches. Having been involved in similar projects from time to time, I have learned to smell undiscipline, laziness, and rebelliousness, the fifth column types, a mile off. It was this approach that made the performance so appalling, and those who did pull their weight were unfortunately pulled under by those who didn't. Yes, the raven was charming, the bugling efficient, and the dove was a problem. That was 50 years ago. And since then, a lot has changed in Aotearoa in music and in reviewing styles. The exchange tells us quite a lot about Owen Jensen's style and intention as a critic. For a start, he considered everything grist to his reviewing mill, including amateur and professional, small ensembles and large orchestras, local school children and seasoned international stars. And he clearly interpreted the position of critic as one who criticised, with the intention of upholding high standards, which often occasioned letters to the editor like this one. When Owen Jensen was my music teacher at secondary school and a smoker of foul-smelling cigarillos, my fellow students and I didn't know much about his ambitions and achievements before that. In 1941, he had founded the lively New Zealand music journal, Music Ho. He named it after a controversial, pessimistic tome predicting a bleak future for 20th century music, written by a feisty Englishman called Constant Lambert, with the full name Music Ho, A Study of Music in Decline. Owen's Music Ho was much more positive than its namesake, and it continued for a remarkable 7 years, publishing articles on composers, performers, music publishing, and criticism. Later in his life, he had a popular radio program for Radio New Zealand, and that was also called Music Ho. In 1946, from his position at the Auckland University Adult Education Centre, Owen started the famous Cambridge Summer Music Schools. He invited Douglas Lilburn to talk to the students, resulting in the memorable and now often quoted address, A Search for Tradition. Jensen began his long association with Wellington's Evening Post as music critic in 1959. I'm sure some of you will remember him towards the end of his time. He based his reviews on a lifetime working with music as a practitioner, a listener, and a colleague. He was knowledgeable, opinionated, and a lively writer, and he was stimulating discussion about what makes a good program and a good performance. Critics, of course, have been reviled by some. Stravinsky was clearly no fan. I had another dream the other day about music critics, he wrote once. They were small and rodent-like, with padlocked ears, as if they had stepped out of a painting by Goya. My topic for this lecture is the place of music criticism and commentary in the musical ecosystem in this country. I've chosen words like endangered and ecosystem because our musical world is many-faceted, like our environment, with a lot of issues of cause and effect. A few words about the man himself. Douglas Lilburn, seen here in a painting by Rita Angus, was my teacher at Victoria University in 1967, my colleague there from 1977 till his retirement in 1980, and my friend until his death in 2001, aged 85. I hope Douglas might approve of my topic. We know he was very aware that our musicians and composers need a national context, and in his famous and deeply thoughtful Cambridge talk that I've already mentioned, and his later lecture, A Search for a Language, he addressed the issues of our culture, tradition, and musical language with eloquence and some zeal. There are many features of a healthy music ecosystem, and Douglas was well aware of them. His establishment of both Aotearoa Music Press and the Lilburn Trust show his commitment went way beyond composing his own music. Funding is needed to make the work possible, both composition and performance. We need ways to record, publish and broadcast the work of our composers and performers, and we need to keep a record of our past. As we head forward in any endeavour, it's salutary to know where we've come from and what we've already explored. I'm aware, for instance, as has been mentioned, that this year, 2024, is the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the invaluable archive of New Zealand music at the Turnbull Library, and that was set up at the suggestion of Douglas Lilburn. There must also be ways to inform people about it all and to place it in some kind of national and international context. There have to be publications and platforms on which to champion it. Above all, there must be ways to make sure that the music of our composers and the work of our performing musicians reaches an audience. The triangle of music involves creators, performers, and audiences. If music is not heard, does it exist? Douglas's own first tertiary qualification was in journalism, and he himself wrote some reviews of concerts for the Christchurch Press, sharing the role with Freddie Page. Reviews in those days were published anonymously, or at least unsigned. Douglas used language well, as we see from his letters and writings and from his now famous searching talks, and in Christchurch as a young man he had close associations with writers through the so-called Caxton Circle, as well as with painters and other artists in what was a close-knit community. That community also included those who reviewed his music. All his premieres received published reviews. Dorothea Turner, who wrote as DFT, once expressed a view that there could have been some bias in his favour, since his friends were eager for him to succeed. Partiality, or the perception of it, remains an issue for critics today, particularly in the small community of New Zealand where one is inevitably writing about one's friends and colleagues. The model for music criticism in the 20th century in New Zealand came, like many other aspects of our classical music culture, from Britain. So did some of the critics, who were mostly male. Some were willing to criticise in strong language and reveal bias in the opposite direction to that favouritism Dorothea Turner was concerned about. Some here may remember the name L.D. Austin. Lewis Daly Austin was born in London in 1877, immigrated to New Zealand in adulthood, and established what today we'd call a portfolio career, teaching, playing piano for silent films, and conducting cinema orchestras. With the advent of the talkies, he moved to music journalism and wrote about music for nearly 40 years, from 1929. He was also, in the words of music historian John Thompson, an indefatigable writer of provocative letters to the editor. Austin was proudly parochial and Victorian, and his tastes were determinedly stuck in the 19th century. For him, Brahms was the last composer to write worthwhile chamber music. Chopin was the greatest composer of all time, and contemporary composers were incapable of pleasing. As Thompson wrote, although regarded by some as a trenchant and provocative critic, Austin could more accurately be described as obsessionally retrogressive. Douglas Lilburn felt the lash of his pen many times. After attending a performance of Lilburn's 1943 Sonata in C for violin and piano, Austin wrote vehemently, "Wild horses could never drag me to another example of such decomposition." He was, however, somehow persuaded to drag himself to the radio for the premiere broadcast of Douglas's 1949 Sonata for Piano, of which Austin wrote, "It sounded very much like two cats upon the keyboard, one at each end, and if they both gave birth to kittens during the broadcast, I should not be surprised." He then went on to damn the piece, which was played by Frederick Page, declaring there was not one single bar of genuine musical inspiration or the slightest sign of creative ability in this composition. I'm going to play you a little piece of the piece in question, played by pianist Jan Liu, who's a great champion for New Zealand music and here tonight, and you can make up your own minds about Austin's view. A negative review from Austen, of course, could well have been seen as a badge of honour. There were, of course, other influential critics who looked much more favourably on Douglas's music. Owen Jensen was one, and the other I'll talk about tonight was Frederick Page, the pianist for that premiere scorned by Austen. This portrait of Fred was painted by his wife, the esteemed painter Evelyn Page. I knew Freddie from 1965 when I became his student at Victoria University, sitting in Music 1 alongside my friend Lau Creswell. Freddie was a great character as professor of music, and I have many amusing memories of him. Of his contempt for recordings of music. In those days they were vinyl LPs, and he'd wipe them carelessly with the corner of the chalk-dusty academic gown that all lecturers wore before playing us the inevitably scratchy musical examples in class. And of his playing the very challenging four-hands version of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring with Jenny MacLeod, during which, whenever Fred felt himself getting into trouble, his foot would creep towards the comfort of the sustaining pedal, at which point Jenny would viciously kick it away. Freddie's great strength as teacher and later critic was his advocacy for contemporary music, particularly that of the 20th century European avant-garde. He favoured Schoenberg and the mid-century composers he met and heard when he visited the famous summer music school at Darmstadt in Germany, but also, at least sometimes, the work of New Zealand composers. He had a big influence on Lilburn's life, having persuaded him to come to Wellington in the 1940s to work in the brand new music department headed by Freddie. Freddie became music critic of the New Zealand Listener in 1975, when he was 69, writing a column on alternate weeks with first Gavin Saunders and then William Dart. He wrote the columns of Concert Review for 8 years until 1983, when he took what was intended to be a short leave after a health event and died before his return. John Thompson contributed a chapter to Fred's memoir, A Musician's Journal, choosing the title The Terror of the Listener. This caricature of Fred by Juliet Peter appeared on the cover of The Listener some decades before he became the magazine's critic, but it captures the style of the man. Writing about Fred, some people have used words like dilettante and gadfly. In a small society, his forthright expressions of negative views made him some enemies, and he was indeed both inconsistent and unpredictable. During his time with The Listener, he became notorious for reviewing an imaginary concert program that he wished he'd heard instead of the one that was actually played. It was all part of his determined focus on repertoire, urging our major institutions like the National Orchestra and chamber music societies to turn away from favoured and conservative, mostly English composers and be more adventurous and contemporary. One of his most used phrases in his columns was a slightly querulous, "Why could we not have had?" followed by suggestions, almost invariably of 20th century European works like Berlioz's Sinfonia or Stockhausen's Carré that might have challenged the audience. New Zealand audiences were perhaps not quite ready for Fred's tastes. And when he didn't enjoy a performance, Fred pulled no punches. When the famous Kantarsky brothers played a two-piano version of Reger's Variations for Orchestra on a theme of Mozart, he was deeply disappointed with the composition. Reaching for watery images, a bit like Owen Jensen before him, he described it as a lumbering sea elephant of a piece. One was drowned in a sea of notes. My guess is that many of the audience went down for a third time. I struggled and gave up. Hell, for me, would be the complete works of Max Reger, played forever and ever on FM quadraphonic sound, interspersed with Holst's The Planets, in a no-exit room. A Listener sub-editor chose to illustrate that review with a picture of Reger and the caption, "Hell is his complete works." Freddie had some blind spots, including electronic music and what we would call the experimental works of the mid-20th century and beyond. "Utter bosh," he said once of some of the latter. He offended many, including Douglas at times, but his airy dismissal of music and performances he didn't enjoy was always accompanied by a liveliness of spirit and a joyous delight in his own naughtiness. His energetic columns were essential reading for many of us. I've used the word context a couple of times, but so far I've been talking about music and criticism in New Zealand in the 20th century up to about the 1980s. Maybe it's time to speed up the narrative. Our reviewing past was influenced by the approach to music criticism in Britain and Europe, as were our musical institutions and their program curation. But Aotearoa New Zealand has undergone a period of rapid change in the past half-century or so, as indeed has the whole world. And the impact of those changes on the music being created here and elsewhere is perhaps most notable for the enormously wide range of approach, influence, and cultural reach. Since Gillian Whitehead began collaborating with Taiwhanga musician Richard Nunns, many of our composers and musicians have begun exploring this remarkable new sound world, often in partnerships between tangata whenua and Pākehā. On the screen are Ariana Tikau and Al Fraser. Ariana is a singer and composer from Kaitahu and a player of Tangapuro, and Al is a Pākehā musician and scholar of Scottish heritage who has spent many years researching traditional Māori instruments and is also a skilled player. Their mahi is a current and fruitful example of a creative Māori-Pākehā partnership. Globally, in many aspects of our lives, the pace of change accelerated in the late 20th century, and the arts and music within the arts also changed rapidly, embracing what we can now, with hindsight, understand more broadly as modernism than postmodernism, alongside experimental practices of all kinds, electronic technology and ethnomusicology. Now, in the 21st century, in Aotearoa New Zealand, we're working in a musical and cultural ecosystem that is, as is music around the world, most notable for its multiplicity. Our musical world here increasingly includes Mataranga Māori, Māori knowledge, including the renaissance of Te Reo and Tangapuro. It's also operating in a global context where digitisation is front and centre. And music is an art form that since the mid-20th century has valued and practised all kinds of boundary crossing, cultural boundaries, art form boundaries, stylistic and genre boundaries, and more. And we're promoting the arts to a multi-generational audience that has embraced the technological changes and made them part of their daily and hourly lives. As the digital natives of Generation Z reach adulthood, those of us in the boomer generation had better keep up or fall out of society. The music critic also needs to keep up with contemporary developments. An example is the growing popularity of a concept of reimagination, creative presentation of the works of the past that bring a contemporary relevance to the art and enable us to see and hear it in new ways. It's much more than just adding illustrative images to an existing work. At its best, this approach involves a complete rethinking of the original artwork, maintaining its artistic integrity while viewing the work through a contemporary lens. We've had some great recent examples in Aotearoa. Voices New Zealand's magical concert Mozart reimagined a Requiem is one of my recent favourites. The slopes of Mount Erebus in the Antarctic in 1979, where 257 people died in a tragic aircraft crash, seem very far from the Vienna of 1791 in which Mozart died, leaving his Requiem unfinished. Composer Robert Wiramu's reimagined Requiem uses Mozart's glorious and familiar music throughout, though not always in the order Mozart intended. Wiramu also uses highly imaginative instrumental and vocal timbres, depicting both the Antarctic scenes and the anguished emotions of the story. Direct use of Mozart's music by Wiramu to tell this tragic story is culturally and musically audacious. It would be easy for it to become obvious and literal, or perhaps mawkishly sentimental. Making changes to the composition of a master like Mozart could seem presumptuous. Threading Maori concepts through the whole narrative might risk cultural dissonance. These pitfalls are avoided with great subtlety and imagination in this profoundly moving work of art, which held the audience's hushed attention throughout, Some of you may have attended the Wellington performance, and I'm pleased to see that it's going to the South Island next year. Other examples I've written about in recent years include Morpheus, a reorchestrating of Gluck's Baroque music by composer Gareth Farr, combined with Siva Samoa, Samoan dance, and the choreography of Neil Irimia of Black Grace Dance Company. So what is the role of the music critic in this ever-diversifying musical ecosystem? As a critic, I believe I have 4 potential and overlapping roles. In the role of critic, I should have opinions, positive and negative, and express these clearly. The critic of old was wont to express the negative opinions in colourful language, as we've seen, never mind the destructive impact. I'm more circumspect. An older critic once said to me, use a light touch for the negatives, and I do. But I guess there's an ethical issue too. Really, a critic must say what they think or choose to say nothing at all. A reviewer is describing what happened, perhaps including some opinions and context, but mostly maintaining a fairly neutral position. Sometimes reviewers add some information about the music that has been performed. A storyteller seems to me a more interesting role, telling the story of the concert or performance, using descriptive and engaging language, perhaps including not only a lively story of the performance or composition, but relating the audience's reaction, be it hushed silence or standing ovation. The champion is perhaps the riskiest position on what may be a continuum. As a champion, the music writer is taking the side of the performers or composers, lifting them up, encouraging the reader to think well of them, perhaps buy a ticket, or consider listening more willingly to their compositions in future. So is this role overly partial? I'm well aware of what's involved in creating, rehearsing, staging a performance, a new festival, a challenging contemporary work. A quick verbal demolition job, however entertaining to read, seems gratuitous and unnecessarily destructive. Conductor Willie Southgate said to me once, if you prick us, we bleed. Without falsely praising where praise is not due, I'm inclined to occupy the right-hand side of this continuum, emphasising the positive, using a light touch for the negative, encouraging rather than complaining. Maybe it's time for me to widen the lens for a moment and talk about what music criticism can do, and to some extent, what it has always done. Music commentators and critics can add value to the audience experience by providing context, interpretation, opinion, information, explication, and comparison. We can point out and comment on sector and art form trends. We can advocate for specific groups, for example, Taiwhanga musicians, women composers, emerging artists. We may be able to influence programming choices through advocacy, for example, for New Zealand composers. We can encourage audiences to attend events and concerts. We may open doors to less mainstream areas of music. For some, that's contemporary music or new music, sonic arts. Sometimes we might contribute to professional development for performers and composers. And we should initiate or contribute to conversations about music and about sector issues. Peter referred to my story, We Need to Talk About Chamber Music. It was, in fact, my most read story this year. And I believe it did indeed contribute to an important sector conversation. So how did I get to a place where I'm talking about music criticism? My own journey as a music critic began in the late 1960s when, as a university student, I was asked to contribute a few concert reviews to the short-lived but ambitious music magazine Third Stream. Later, after some time away from Aotearoa, I did some casual reviewing for the Dominion newspaper, and I've never forgotten the advice of the more experienced critic and composer Dorothy Freed, who also wrote for the Dom. Remember, she said, you're telling a story for the people who were not there. I've discovered that, in fact, the people who were there are also very interested in one's review, to confirm or argue with their reactions, or to enable them to relive the concert from someone else's perspective. I also wrote quite a few articles over the years for Canzona, the magazine of the Composers Association, and for William Dart's splendid Music in New Zealand, founded in 1988, an invaluable source of interesting material that eventually ceased publication in 2002, as almost all music magazines in New Zealand have. The economic realities of publishing such journals have sadly caught up with most. Soon after Freddie Page retired from his listener column, I took it over in 1983 and wrote fortnightly, sharing with William Dart week about for 6 years. Towards the end of that time, Ian Dando joined us for a Christchurch perspective. Our column was called Concert, was allocated 800 words, and I could choose what to write about, reviewing one concert a column or more if I liked. I could also explore relevant issues around what was happening in the concert halls of the country. Typed copy had to be hand-delivered to the listener office on Tuesday mornings. Those years with the listener in the 1980s were my first substantial reviewing gig, undertaken while I was lecturing at what is now the New Zealand School of Music, and they were very enjoyable even when the word limit eventually shrank from 800 to 600 words a column. Like Freddie Page before me, I often championed the music of our own time, and a letter to the listener editor during the 1980s, channeling L.D. Austin perhaps, took exception to my suggesting it would be good for audiences to hear that music, accusing me of totalitarian intellectual arrogance. I considered getting the phrase printed on a lapel badge. Ethical issues for critics include direct conflicts of interest, and it was these that caused me to stop writing for the listener in 1989 and take more than 2 decades away from such commentary. I was busy in arts management roles and also governance, roles that meant I would have had all kinds of conflicts as a critic. In 2012, having retired from full-time arts management, I returned to writing for the listener and reviewing concerts for Radio New Zealand's now abandoned Upbeat program. By then, the listener no longer published reviews of concerts that had already happened. The focus was, as it remains, on previewing upcoming events with the occasional album review. I wrote a lot of artist profiles and had some wonderful conversations with some big international names like David Harrington of Kronos Quartet, violinist Hilary Hahn, composer Tan Dun, cellist Colin Carr, Roland Peelman, who was then of the Australian Song Company, and lots of New Zealand composers and musicians. And then, leaping forward, it was 2020, a watershed year for the world, and for some of the same and for some different reasons for my ongoing journey as a music critic. First, in early February 2020 came an existential threat to RNZ Concert, which led to the campaign Save RNZ Concert. My first move when the RNZ management plan to eviscerate Concert became public was to contact my editor at The Listener and urge them to undertake some investigative journalism about RNZ's short-sighted and destructive plan. I offered to write it, but we agreed I was too close to the story as a former manager of Concert, and so The Listener undertook its own investigation, talking to Helen Clark and others as wonderful advocates for the network, and I was contracted to contribute an opinion piece alongside the main story. My subsequent involvement in the almost 3 years-long campaign that successfully ensured that Concert is still part of RNZ's offering is another story. But it demonstrated the efficacy of having a platform through which one could express an opinion. Then, still in 2020, on 25th of March, as you'll recall, New Zealand locked down to protect the populace against COVID-19. That first lockdown lasted almost 2 months, till 13 May. In the middle of it, on April the 2nd, Bauer Media, an Australian-based company that owned The Listener, as well as Women's Weekly, Metro, North and South and other magazines, announced it was ceasing publication because the lockdown had rendered these unviable, perhaps in view of their dependence on advertising revenue, but also because the government had ruled that supermarkets could remain open but could not sell magazines. Now, I believe a healthy art form needs to include critical discourse, so there I was, locked down, with time to write, and no one and nowhere obvious to publish my work. 2020 was Beethoven's 250th birthday, and I already had an article or two underway for that, plus other pieces in the pipeline, and May was going to be, as usual, New Zealand Music Month. So having considered starting a website before, my hand was forced. I enlisted my son Ollie Campbell, a designer and web developer who lives in Melbourne and was also locked down, and we had several Zoom sessions whereby he provided the expert technical help I needed to set up my website, 5 Lines. I started loading content, including a few older articles that were still relevant, and eventually by May I was ready to launch. I emailed people I knew who might be interested and invited them to subscribe. I had at that stage about 10 stories on the site, and by May 14 I had 89 subscribers. I sent them my first subscriber email with 2 news stories, a profile of American director Peter Sellers, who had visited New Zealand for festival performances that year, and a review of the live-streamed NZSO shared concert that I had experienced at home. Now, 5 Lines is in its 5th year, and there are over 185 illustrated stories on the site, including artist profiles, previews and reviews of concerts and operas and albums, and opinion pieces on issues relevant to the music sector. As well as Save RNZ Concert, I've participated by writing in the campaign to save the breadth of offering of the New Zealand School of Music, and earlier this year I wrote the opinion piece we've mentioned, attempting to save Chamber Music New Zealand from itself. When I set up the site, my son cautioned against having high expectations of visitation. Most special interest sites like this, Mum, he said, attract just a few readers in the first year, and it will grow after that. In the remaining 8 months of 2020, 4,500 unique visitors came to the site, which received 8,000 page views from 48 countries. People around the world seem to be interested in what's happening on our stages. My most popular story that year was a profile of NZSO conductor Gemma New called On the Podium in a Pandemic. 5 Lines now averages over 24,000 page views annually and over 13,000 unique visitors a year. Traffic to the site is driven by regular emails to subscribers, but also by social media and by artists, organisations and subscribers sharing the stories with their networks. I'll just give you a few figures. So visitors to the site are predominantly from Aotearoa New Zealand. Almost 3/4 of the visitors are from here. But there are also thousands of visitors annually from overseas, including Europe, the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Asia and elsewhere. The largest number of subscribers and visitors are New Zealanders, unsurprisingly, because of the content. But this year so far, there have been visitors from 85 countries, and it all keeps growing. 2024 page views are currently up 15% on last year, and unique visitors 13%. I quite like numbers. I'm writing mostly about classical or crossover music in Aotearoa New Zealand, our performers and composers, about what's happening here. If I write about artists who live elsewhere, like the Brodsky Quartet with William Barton, or English composer Jonathan Dove, or the Van Diemen's Band from Australia, it's because they're performing here, or someone here is performing their work, or they're Kiwi expats, or they're from elsewhere but live here now. This is the marketing pitch. The content is available free because I want it to be read. And when people come up to me at concerts and say, I subscribe to 5 Lines or I enjoy reading your stuff, I'm very chuffed. It's a vote in support of what I do. And many subscribers now email me or put comments under the stories, so I'm enjoying an ongoing conversation. The Listener returned to publication in September 2020 and invited me to write a weekly column, at first about things people could experience at home, online or on radio. It was called Classical Home Listening. I wrote that short weekly column as well as 5 Lines and occasionally republished my listener stories on my site, but after 2 years of doing both, I decided to focus my energies on 5 Lines. Some of my subscribers are here tonight, and I thank you for your support. And if you're not a subscriber, please do join the 5 Lines community. Now back to that ecosystem in which I do this work. In the last couple of years, Creative New Zealand, Toi Aotearoa, undertook a benchmark research project to explore arts and culture media coverage, reporting and artist portrayal in New Zealand media over the 12 months between July 2021 and June 2022. They did so because they perceived, and I quote, a deterioration of arts media coverage, with both the media and cultural sectors increasingly under-resourced and under strain. This has not only led to fewer people covering arts and culture stories, but fewer people in our cultural sectors ensuring these stories are visible. CNZ's researchers looked at traditional media content in print, online and broadcast. They called the project Visibility Matters, based on their belief that the media is an important bridge between artists and the public. In broad terms, they found that 13% of total media coverage over the period was related to arts and culture. That's the red and orange slices at the top of the pie. But that 75% of that was coverage of television, film and pop music. That is, pop culture and entertainment. That's the red slice. Beyond that popular cultural coverage, just 3.25%, that's the little orange slice at the top, was related to all the other arts, cultural and heritage activities. So just 3.25% of all media coverage was about visual arts, performing arts, craft and object, poetry and literature, multimedia, Maori arts and Pacific arts. Classical music was a sliver within that orange 3.2%. For comparison, about 1/4 of all media coverage in New Zealand was focused on sport over the same reference period. That's the green slice. CNZ's Creative New Zealand's report is talking about all media coverage, not just critical writing and reviews. Criticism and music criticism within that is a vanishingly small percentage of media coverage. RNZ Concert no longer has a reviewing slot, for instance, and the listener no longer reviews concerts, offering previews written from a journalistic rather than critical perspective. It allocates 4 to 6 pages a week to popular music coverage, but considerably less than 1 page to the column now called Classical. Occasionally it publishes a classical album review. Book reviews, on the other hand, are still allocated many pages weekly. Daily newspapers mostly review only events in large venues with large audiences, orchestral concerts and operas. Smaller events, including chamber music, choral concerts, recitals and so on, seldom rate a mention in daily newspapers, with some smaller cities like Dunedin the exception. Steve Garden of Rattle Records, an invaluable record label producing albums of classical and crossover music from our performers and composers, tells me I'm almost the only writer reviewing albums. And SOUNZ, Centre for New Zealand Music, confirms that this is also the case with respect to reviews of the recorded work of our composers. Owen Jensen's scrapbooks, which are stored in this library, show that 50 or 60 years ago, his reviews of all kinds of Wellington musical performances appeared several times a week and were allocated a decent number of column inches. Further, now some publications no longer pay fees for reviews, assuming exposure and free tickets to the concert provided by the presenters is sufficient recompense. The result is the rise of the hobbyist critic, often someone who would normally be an interested audience member, sadly sometimes without sufficient professional musical background to write about the professionals on stage with credible authority. The spin-off amongst independent media features in the Creative New Zealand report as a platform that takes arts and culture seriously. I greatly admire the spin-off and have been a member for many years, especially enjoying their very comprehensive book coverage, but they have obviously made an editorial decision to mostly avoid classical music and some other art forms as well. Their culture section is called in bold letters pop culture. They have published some artist profiles and other art stories recently, including of composer Victoria Kelly and musician and poet Cadence Chung. These have been commissioned by Creative New Zealand. There's no doubt that music criticism and reviewing of the kind I've been talking about is of declining interest to editors? Is it of declining interest to readers? Or just to readers of a certain demographic, maybe those identified as of interest to advertisers? Is this a cultural or commercial decision? One unfortunate consequence of the declining critical coverage is the absence of platforms on which younger critics can publish their work and develop their craft. When I began writing music reviews many decades ago, I could write at least occasionally for a daily newspaper or one of several other print journals. Now, available publications for such work have shrunk almost out of sight. So I come back to my initial question. Is the music critic an endangered species in Aotearoa New Zealand? And if so, what are the solutions? Before we get either too glum or too cynically philosophical about all of this, I have a few suggestions. When rescuing an endangered species, environmentalists first identify the problem and then shine a light on that species. Creative New Zealand has to some extent done both of these things through their recent research and reports. I'm doing it too in a small way tonight. I believe critics and critical discourse can play a positive role in all art forms. Let's have the discussion more broadly and keep it going and work it out as a sector and its audience. In its new Mirrors report, a response to the Visibility Matters research, Creative New Zealand itself plans to do something about, quote, strengthening our criticism and reviewing culture. It's also talking about setting up a dedicated fund for arts and culture media projects, although its own overall funding has not increased and their timeframe is a little unclear. Creative New Zealand's reports acknowledge that both the arts and media sectors are under pressure and under-resourced. They recently set up a dedicated cross-agency program for arts and culture podcasts. The first round, which may be the only round for a few years, closed a couple of months ago, and they expect to allocate the $250,000 putia to about 4 of the over 200 applicants. Projects will also get production and development support from the partnership agencies involved, which include Radio New Zealand and New Zealand On Air. Now, with a benchmark study in hand, Creative New Zealand also hopes to repeat the Visibility Matters research over time, budget willing, and will continue to work to raise the profile of the issue with other funders and encourage media to increase their arts and culture coverage. I'm also, through Five Lines, taking preliminary and independent action by working to employ guest reviewers from a younger generation of musically well-qualified writers. And I've applied to Creative New Zealand for some funding support for an intern initiative from next year, with my fingers crossed, knowing the pressure their funds are under. We might need some other institutional support to address this issue. Perhaps our universities can acknowledge that their senior music students and recent graduates could usefully add music criticism to their portfolio careers, and find ways within their courses for them to develop their skills. Universities have been teaching science communication for some time. Maybe we need a generation skilled in music communication. Perhaps there are musically knowledgeable people with good ears in our concert audiences who would like to write about music as commentator or critic. In the late 1980s, I participated as one of several tutors in a continuing education course at Victoria University called The Attentive Ear on many aspects of music criticism. I recall Creative New Zealand when I worked there organising a seminar for critics a couple of decades ago. Might our larger music organisations collaborate to organise something similar? And maybe both audience members and music organisations need to let the editors of newspapers, websites and other online publications and broadcast media know that they'd like to read about or listen to more music criticism alongside the other art stories featured. My last musical example tonight, and we are very much on the home stretch, so thank you for your patient listening, is I'm going to play an excerpt from a work called Papatuanuku by Selena Fisher and Jerome Putama Kavanagh, premiered last year by the Auckland Philharmonia. I'm sorry Douglas Lilburn isn't here to hear what our composers and performers are creating in Aotearoa New Zealand in the 21st century. I think the man who delivered his Search for a Language lecture would be moved and delighted by the way music in Aotearoa is not just a single language of our own, but two cultures in marvellous musical conversation, as it is in this work. Music like this is our unique part of the global zeitgeist, crossing musical boundaries and reimagining both the past and the future. I see classical music in the 21st century as a generous and outward-looking art form, with arms wide enough to embrace all kinds of styles and cultures and performance practices and share the results from stages to audiences. It's not about saying pop music can be called chamber music now. It's about acknowledging the whole history of classical music and allowing it to be present in all the music we hear, while finding a completely contemporary musical language that communicates who we are now. It's not easy to pull all the threads together, but many of our creative practitioners are doing that successfully. And we, the audience, and we, the critics, have to be there to appreciate and champion that mahi and the results we hear and experience. I think there's a very important role today for the music critic in communicating about our contemporary music and performance to audiences and to musicians and to organisations presenting music. There's perhaps an even greater need for the music critic now in our current ecosystem. Western art music is changing rapidly, and the critic should not be a peripheral criticising figure, but a bridge between the creative artist and the audience, seeking to understand the creators and turning that understanding into words and ideas that enlighten and offer insights to the audience. As Creative New Zealand says in its recent New Mirrors report, there is a clear relationship between strong arts and culture media coverage and a thriving creative sector. The media acts as a crucial bridge between artists and the public, giving artists a platform to amplify their stories. It's my hope that the music critic maintains a significant role as part of that bridge. Nā mihi nui, e hoa. Nā mihi mai aha ai te puna mataranga o Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
You've worked very hard. Tēnā koe, Elizabeth. E mihi kau ana ki a koe e te pau, te kai whakaoho-oho hoke ki a tātou katoa, I roto I te pūkenga me te tōhungatanga o te mahi ki te aupuro. Nō reira, tēnā koe e te rangatira. Ko Hannah Darroch tōku ingoa, ko au te tumu whakarai o toi te ara puoro o Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm Hannah Darroch, the new Chief Executive at SOUNZ Centre for New Zealand Music. Thank you to the Lilburn Trust for inviting me to give this evening's vote of thanks. And thanks to you, Elizabeth, for your insight into both the history and current state and potentially future state of music commentary in the very interlinked musical ecosystem, stealing your word, we have here in Aotearoa. And I say interlinked with no exaggeration. 20 years ago, I was starting my music student journey here in Wellington at Victoria University, where you spent many years, and it's clear that I've followed her around quite a bit since then. NZSO, RNZ Concert, SOUNZ. I have no doubt you were on panels deciding on grants that I had potentially applied for. She nods. In the audience at many concerts which I was performing in. And we finally met properly in person earlier this year, which was a pleasure. And how lucky are we in Aotearoa to have women like Elizabeth to follow in the footsteps of. There's undoubtedly a link between her dedicated career and the fact that we have so many capable women in leadership in the arts in this country. Thanks for being a role model to us, someone to see and to think, maybe I could do that one day too. And now millennials are starting to move into leadership. And I know that is an interesting mindset for us all, because time moves so quickly. But as we heard in this lecture, age actually means very little. Elizabeth, I love how entrepreneurial you've been in embracing the changing digital environment. COVID hit, you just set up a website and you started an online movement. You kept finding ways to champion our wonderful musical activities in this country when some methods were starting to disappear. Five Lines and other such platforms help New Zealand to present itself online as a country with a thriving, vibrant, unique and high-level art scene. Your question, if music is not heard, does it really exist, really resonated with me tonight. I enjoyed hearing your take on the four overlapping roles you see the music critic having: critic, reviewer, storyteller, champion. And I think you'll all agree it was quite a gift to sit here this evening and consider this in terms of perhaps where we source our information, who we choose to listen to, who we believe, maybe what compels us to choose to go to a concert, or maybe what makes us get behind a particular ensemble who are choosing to do something new, or perhaps not to. Sometimes reviews and articles might also give us a moment of, phew, not the only one who was thinking that. So thank you for your validation as well. I was also struck by some of the quite scathing reviews in your introduction, which I think garnered many a laugh, and it made me put my own performer hat on and really think about that word critic. An instrumental training, we are our own critics all the time. Long before any of us reach a stage worthy of having someone else critique our performance in a public forum, we spend hours a day doing that ourselves, all alone in a room. The ingrained self-critique becomes a very routine part of life for the performer. This lecture also brought to mind reviews about my playing that I have long since forgotten about. One about 10 years ago, the opening of Britain's Sea Interludes. It's notoriously difficult. It's two flutes in unison, up high, third, fourth octave, playing pianissimo. And we thought, oh, that went pretty well. I was quite happy with that. Anything can go horribly wrong. The review came in, specifically mentioning that section. Flute is something along the lines of flutes played softly and timidly in the opening. Thank you. Skilled work. And another from a Chamber Music New Zealand tour with a North American guitarist and me on flute. And the review of the music was fine, but he took great pleasure in adding a footnote where he noted the use of the word flutist in our introduction and how, in fact, flautist is the British-derived and therefore correct word for flute player. I've used flute player ever since. And then I left town. And I also, as I was sitting there, remembered another occasion where a reviewer had been fixated on a cor anglais she had seen on stage that she was adamant had not been used during the concert and referred to it in her review. And everyone in the woodwind section knew it had been used. And then there may have been a future concert where some additional woodwind instruments were sitting on stage. The role of the music critic has appeared in a lot of my work life in marketing at Chamber Music New Zealand, always hoping for a great review of an early concert on a tour to boost ticket sales for the rest of the tour. As someone who's written scripts for RNZ Concert, program notes and season brochure copies for orchestras, reviews from years gone by are amazing for finding quotes to add weight to an argument, and we would be lost without them. I'd also like to quickly highlight your section about New Zealand music today and how it's blending the orchestral instruments with taonga and speaking to Lilburn's speeches last century about finding a New Zealand identity in our music. Music commentary is essential for getting that message across about our unique musical landscape, and going digital does make that much easier. I did my doctorate in North America on the subject of extended techniques on flute and how they emulate taonga in a number of contemporary solo works by New Zealand composers. And I can't overstate how amazed North American audiences and researchers were about what's going on here. Thanks to the Lilburn Trust and the National Library for hosting this annual event and allowing us the chance to all be together and to be gifted this time to think about music in the current state of things. And thank you again to Elizabeth for sharing your wisdom today. New Zealand music is certainly much richer for your career's contribution. I hope that many reviewers, commentators, writers, and arts managers continue to follow in your footsteps. May we all continue to lift others up who are new and following in the footsteps of others. As a newcomer, thank you to the Lilburn Trust for the invitation to be here. To Elizabeth Kerr.